resulting from construction of the wall, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by such construction. U.S. Justice Bergenthal alone dissented, but on very narrow grounds. He agreed that international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, and international human rights law are applicable to the occupied Palestinian territory, and must be faithfully complied with by Israel. Since all Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are in violation of the convention, the segments of the wall being built by Israel to protect the settlements are ipso facto in violation of international humanitarian law, that is, most of the wall. So presumably he is disqualified as well, though Israel's own High Court still passes muster. A year later, it ruled that any route of the separation wall must take into account the need to provide security for the Israeli residents of Alfei Menashe in the West Bank, and indeed for all Israelis living in Israeli communities in the Judea and Samaria area, the West Bank, including their property rights. The U.S. political parties agree. The World Court's decision was bitterly condemned by overwhelming majorities of both parties in congressional resolutions. The 2004 Democratic presidential candidate, John Kerry, took a particularly strong stand condemning the court. The reaction, Stephen Zunes commented, reflects the growing bipartisan hostility to any legal restraints on the conduct of the United States and its allies beyond their borders, particularly in the Middle East, and the consensus that any effort to raise legal questions regarding the actions of occupying powers must be forcefully challenged, when the occupying powers are the United States or its clients, that is. Other evidence strongly confirms his judgment. There should be no need to waste time on the claim that the separation wall is motivated by security concerns. Were that the case, the wall would be built on the Green Line, the international border recognized by the entire world, with the exception of Israel and the United States, which had also recognized the border until it sharply shifted policy in the 1970s to support Israel's rejection of a political settlement in favor of further expansion into the occupied territories. If Israel were to build a wall for self-defense, it could be made utterly impregnable, and there would be no international objections for Washington to veto or ignore. But there is a downside. A self-defense wall would not be a major step toward integrating within Israel valuable Palestinian land and crucial resources, primarily water. And it would inconvenience Israelis, including illegal settlers, not Palestinians. Therefore, it is excluded as an option, security having its usual significance in state practice and public rhetoric. Crimes of war and crimes against humanity. Gonzales's legal advice about protecting Bush from the threat of prosecution under the War Crimes Act was proven sound not long after he gave it, in a case far more severe even than the torture scandals. In November 2004, U.S. occupation forces launched their second major attack on the city of Fallujah. The press reported major war crimes instantly with approval. The attack began with a bombing campaign intended to drive out all but the adult male population. Men ages 15 to 45 who attempted to flee Fallujah were turned back. The plans resembled the preliminary stage of the Srebrenica massacre, though the Serb attackers trucked women and children out of the city instead of bombing them out. While the preliminary bombing was underway, Iraqi journalist Nermeen al-Mufti reported from the city of minarets, which once echoed the Euphrates in its beauty and calm, with its plentiful water and lush greenery, a summer resort for Iraqis where people went for leisure, for a swim at the nearby Habanya Lake, for a kebab meal. She described the fate of victims of these bombing attacks, in which sometimes whole families, including pregnant women and babies, unable to flee, along with many others, were killed because the attackers who ordered their flight had cordoned off the city, closing the exit roads. Al-Mufti asked residents whether there were foreign fighters in Fallujah. One man said that he had heard that there were Arab fighters in the city, but he never saw any of them. Then he heard that they had left. Regardless of the motives of those fighters, they have provided a pretext for the city to be slaughtered, he continued, and it is our right to resist. Another said that some Arab brothers were among us, but when the shelling intensified, we asked them to leave, and they did, and then asked a question of his own. Why has America given itself the right to call on UK and Australian and other armies for help, and we don't have the same right? It would be interesting to ask how often that question has been raised in Western commentary and reporting, or how often the analogous question was raised in the Soviet press in the 1980s about Afghanistan. How often was a term like foreign fighters used to refer to the invading armies? How often did reporting and commentary stray from the assumption that the only conceivable question is how well our side is doing, and what the prospects are for our success? It is hardly necessary to investigate. The assumptions are cast in iron. Even to entertain a question about them would be unthinkable. Proof of support for terror, or blaming all the problems of the world on America, Russia, or some other familiar refrain. After several weeks of bombing, the United States began its ground attack in Fallujah. It opened with the conquest of the Fallujah General Hospital. The front-page story in the New York Times reported that patients and hospital employees were rushed out of rooms by armed soldiers and ordered to sit or lie on the floor while troops tied their hands behind their backs. An accompanying photograph depicted the scene. It was presented as a meritorious achievement. The offensive also shut down what officers said was a propaganda weapon for the militants. Fallujah General Hospital, with its stream of reports of civilian casualties. Plainly, such a propaganda weapon is a legitimate target, particularly when inflated civilian casualty figures, inflated because our leader so declared, had inflamed opinion throughout the country, driving up the political costs of the conflict. The word conflict is a common euphemism for U.S. aggression, as when we read on the same pages that now the Americans are rushing in engineers who will begin rebuilding what the conflict has just destroyed. Just the conflict, with no agent, like a hurricane. Some relevant documents passed unmentioned, perhaps because they too are considered quaint and obsolete. For example, the provision of the Geneva Conventions stating that fixed establishments and mobile medical units of the medical service may in no circumstances be attacked, but shall at all times be respected and protected by the parties to the conflict. Thus, the front page of the world's leading newspaper was cheerfully depicting war crimes for which the political leadership could be sentenced to severe penalties under U.S. law. The death penalty, if patients ripped from their beds and manacled on the floor happened to die as a result. The questions did not merit detectable inquiry or reflection. The same mainstream sources told us that the U.S. military achieved nearly all their objectives well ahead of schedule, as much of the city lay in smoking ruins. But it was not a complete success. There was little evidence of dead pack rats in their warrens or on the streets, an enduring mystery. U.S. forces did discover the body of a woman on a street in Fallujah, but it was unclear whether she was an Iraqi or a foreigner. The crucial question, apparently. Another front-page story quotes a senior Marine commander who says that the attack on Fallujah ought to go down in the history books. Perhaps it should. If so, we know on just what page of history it will find its place. Perhaps Fallujah will appear right alongside Grozny, a city of about the same size, with a picture of Bush and Putin gazing into each other's souls. Those who praise, or for that matter even tolerate, all of this can select their own favorite pages of history. The media accounts of the assault were not uniform. Qatar-based